Welcome in. Grab a seat and get comfortable.
Yeah, please do.
Because, you are the essential third member of this conversation today. We always love having you here for these deep dives.
Absolutely. We're glad you're joining us.
So today we are opening up a really remarkable document. It is simply titled The Weekly Source Vault, Chronologies of Global Black History.
It's a fantastic text.
It really is.
Yeah.
And looking at the framework of this material right off the bat, what strikes me immediately is the structural decision to confine the analysis.
To just a few days.
Right, to literally the first 7 days of March. It is this incredibly aggressive compression of time.
It really is.
I mean, we are looking at historical milestones spanning from 1770 all the way to 1965, but they are strictly isolated to events that share a calendar anniversary between March 1st and March 7th.
Which is a bold way to organize history.
Very bold. So my first question to you is why? Why look at history through this highly restrictive single-week aperture?
Well, I think it shatters the illusion of linearity.
Okay, how so?
When we track history chronologically, year by year, we tend to lull ourselves into a false sense of a steady, inevitable march of progress.
Right, like everything is just naturally getting better over time.
Exactly. We view events as isolated islands. But by slicing the calendar vertically, looking only at this specific 7-day window across centuries, we are forced to confront the sheer overwhelming density of human achievement and resistance and systemic evolution.
It's just stacked on top of each other.
Yes. It reveals that the timeline of global Black history isn't just a single thread. It is a heavily layered strata. So to truly extract the value from this vault, we can't just read these dates chronologically.
Yeah, no, that would be boring anyway.
Right. We need to reorganize them thematically to understand the conversations these events are having with one another across the centuries.
I completely agree. If we just run down the list day by day, we miss the architecture of how these moments interact. So for you listening today, we are going to look at the long arc of the law. We'll look at the economic foundations that sustain these movements and the global reverberations of sovereignty.
That's a great roadmap.
And to start, we have to examine the legal battlegrounds. Looking at the milestones clustered in this week, progress is clearly not a straight line.
Not at all.
It is a series of brutal setbacks and highly calculated blueprints. And I think the most glaring setback in this vault falls on March 6, 1857.
The Dred Scott decision.
Exactly, the Dred Scott decision.
It is really the unavoidable starting point for any structural analysis of American legal history.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court ruling that fundamentally denied Black citizenship.
It's a devastating moment in the text.
It is. But the crucial analytical point our source makes is that this decision explicitly accelerated the road to the Civil War.
Accelerated?
Yes. And we need to interrogate the mechanics of that acceleration. When the highest court in a nation permanently closes its doors to an entire demographic.
Just slams them shut.
Slams them shut, stating unequivocally that they possess no standing, no rights, and no future within the legal framework of the state. What are the systemic consequences of that?
That is the core question. Because the word accelerating implies that the tension was already moving toward conflict. But this ruling essentially cut the
brake lines.
Oh, the brake lines, yes. If citizenship is the baseline requirement for legal participation, like the basic right to seek redress or protection, and you completely strip that away, you are telling millions of people that the courtroom is no longer a viable theater of operation.
Precisely.
It feels like the Supreme Court essentially backed the country into a corner where physical violence was literally the only remaining option.
That is the exact mechanism of the acceleration. You see, a functional legal system acts as a pressure valve for societal conflict.
Right, a way to let off steam.
Yes. It provides a nonviolent structural avenue to resolve deep existential disputes. The Dred Scott decision welded that pressure valve shut.
Oh, wow. Welded it shut.
It was a legal ruling that paradoxically proved the absolute limits of the law. By codifying complete subjugation into the constitutional bedrock, it left zero room for legislative compromise or gradual abolition.
It just polarized the political landscape overnight.
Turning theoretical legal debates into inevitable physical geography.
So a legal document that guaranteed a physical war. But if we shift the timeline forward while moving backward on our calendar to March 1st, we encounter a very different kind of legal strategy in the vault.
Right, the 1875 Act.
Yeah, the source highlights the Civil Rights Act of 1875, signed into law to guarantee equal treatment in public accommodations.
A massive milestone.
Huge. But the immediate footnote to this achievement in the text is that it was subsequently struck down by the courts.
Which is heartbreaking.
It is. And on the surface, that reads like a total systemic failure. You pass a law guaranteeing access, and the judiciary just dismantles it.
It is a profound institutional failure of the Reconstruction era. There's no denying that. However, the true historical insight lies in the Vault's assertion that this failed act set the standard for the 1964 Act.
The 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Yes. This introduces the concept of dormant legal architecture.
Okay, I love that phrase, but I have to push back on that a little bit.
Go for it.
If the 1875 Act failed so spectacularly and was deemed unconstitutional by the courts of that era, what utility does a broken blueprint actually have for lawmakers nearly a century later?
That's a fair question.
Right, because why wouldn't the architects of the 1964 Civil Rights Act want to distance themselves from a failed strategy rather than use it as a standard?
Because the failure of the 1875 Act wasn't a failure of the legal logic or the moral argument.
Oh, I see.
It was a failure of the political and judicial environment of the 19th century. The foundation of the country post-Reconstruction simply could not bear the weight of true equality. But the text of the law itself, the specific legislative mechanisms designed to enforce equal treatment in public accommodations, was legally sound.
So the tool worked. The room was just wrong.
That's a great way to put it. By preserving that blueprint, the 1875 lawmakers essentially left a map for future generations.
A map in a bottle.
Exactly. When the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century finally shifted the political realities and prepared the way, the ground lawmakers didn't have to invent a new framework from scratch. They could resurrect the dormant architecture of 1875.
That completely reframes the entire concept of legislative defeat for me. It suggests that even a law that is struck down can function as a placeholder for justice, holding space in the historical record until society catches up to the legislation.
It is a long-term generational strategy.
It really is. And speaking of shifting geographies and strategies, the Vault presents another March 1st legal milestone that pulls our attention entirely away from the traditional theaters of the South or the East Coast.
Yes, we have Weisinger v. Visalia.
Weisinger v. Visalia, the California Supreme Court ruling that made desegregation mandatory in California schools.
And the Vault characterizes this as a West Coast win for the chain.
That specific phrasing, the chain, that is vital. When you study the history of school desegregation, the center of gravity in the narrative is almost always the Deep South.
Almost exclusively.
Right. But this California ruling forces a massive geographical expansion of our understanding. It proves to you, the listener, that the struggle for educational access was a continental phenomenon, not just a regional one.
It completely disrupts the regional containment of civil rights history. The frontier of California in the mid-19th century was operating under a different set of social and economic pressures than the antebellum South. Yet the structural barriers to Black education were aggressively enforced there, too.
The barriers were universal.
They were. So by securing a Supreme Court victory at the state level in California, the Weisinger decision demonstrates how localized legal anchors are necessary to forge a national chain of jurisprudence.
So you're building the chain link by link, state by state.
Precisely. It illustrates a sophisticated, decentralized approach to civil rights. Battles are fought, and precedents are established wherever the population finds itself.
A decentralized legal war. I like that. But as we have seen with Dred Scott, the courtroom is not the only place where the parameters of citizenship are decided. Sometimes the legal system remains utterly paralyzed until it is forced into motion by external physical realities.
Which brings us to March 7th, 1965.
Bloody Sunday, the most visceral event in this section of the Vault.
The Selma to Montgomery March. A day defined by the brutal state-sanctioned violence inflicted upon John Lewis and hundreds of peaceful demonstrators.
And the source material connects this physical confrontation directly to a legislative outcome. It states that the events of Bloody Sunday forced the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
Forced is the key word there.
I want to interrogate that word forcing. It creates a really stark dichotomy. We just discussed the intellectual architectural work of the 1875 Act and the state-level maneuvering of Weisinger. But here, the language shifts to sheer force.
It does.
Does legislation of this magnitude only happen at the point of a baton?
Well, it speaks to the absolute limits of legislative goodwill. The institutional avenues for securing voting rights in the South had been systematically blocked. They were gerrymandered and legislated into oblivion.
There was no legal path left.
None. When the legal architecture is entirely co-opted by the oppressor, filing a brief or debating a bill becomes completely insufficient. Forcing legislation in this context refers to the strategic deployment of physical presence.
To expose what was happening.
Yes, to expose the inherent violence of the status quo.
It is the weaponization of optics. By marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they weren't just protesting, they were manifesting the invisible violence of voter suppression into highly visible, undeniable physical violence.
For the whole world to see.
Exactly. They forced the federal government to look at the blood on the asphalt and make a binary choice. The sterility of the legal debate was totally obliterated by the reality of the physical sacrifice.
It perfectly synthesizes the relationship between grassroots mobilization and institutional law. The Voting Rights Act was not benevolently granted by a sudden awakening of the legal system.
No, it definitely wasn't.
It was a concession extracted by the moral gravity and physical endurance of the marchers. Bloody Sunday proves that when the courtroom doors are locked, the street becomes the highest appellate court in the land.
The street becomes the highest court. That is a powerful image. And that transition from seeking legal permission to actively extracting power bridges us into the second major theme of this vault.
The building of foundations.
Right, because legal rights are theoretical until you have the infrastructure to actually exercise them. So we have to look at the foundations being built in this single week of March. The economics, the educational institutions, and the technological innovations.
And the sheer scale of our first milestone here is staggering.
It's almost difficult to comprehend. The establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau on March 3rd, 1865.
The Source Vault outlines its mandate very clearly, providing social, medical, and educational aid to 4 million newly freed people.
I want you to just pause and consider the logistical reality of that number. 4 million people.
It's an entire population.
We are talking about a population roughly the size of a modern European nation, transitioning overnight from being legally classified as chattel to being autonomous citizens, and doing all of this in the middle of a devastated post-war economy.
It's unfathomable.
How do you even begin to build this social, medical, and educational infrastructure for a population of that magnitude from absolute scratch?
It is an undertaking of unprecedented ambition and complexity. You are not just integrating a population, you are actively having to construct the very concept of civic life for millions of individuals who have been deliberately and violently excluded from it.
Excluded from everything.
Everything. Let's examine the 3 pillars the vault identifies. The medical and social aid were triage. They were addressing the immediate catastrophic trauma of systemic enslavement, reuniting fractured families, negotiating labor contracts to prevent immediate resubjugation through debt peonage.
Because that was a very real threat right away.
A constant threat. And providing basic health care where absolutely none existed.
Triage makes sense. But the third pillar, the educational aid, feels fundamentally different to me. Social and medical aid are about surviving the present, but educational aid is about engineering the future.
That is the perfect distinction. It is the transition from survival to sovereignty. The educational mandate of the Freedmen's Bureau was the recognition that true emancipation requires intellectual infrastructure.
You have to know your rights to use them.
Exactly. You cannot defend your newly acquired legal rights if you do not have the literacy to read the contracts, to understand the laws, or articulate your political will. The Bureau laid the rudimentary groundwork for a network of knowledge.
And the timeline provided by our vault shows exactly how quickly that rudimentary groundwork evolved into elite institutional power.
It was incredibly fast.
Just 24 months later. On March 2nd, 1867, we see the chartering of Howard University.
Characterized in the text as the Mecca and the premier institution for Black intellectual and legal leadership.
The progression from 1865 to 1867 is breathtaking. You go from establishing basic functional literacy programs for 4 million traumatized people to chartering a university designed to produce an intellectual vanguard.
In just 2 years.
The phrase legal leadership jumps out at me because it perfectly connects back to our first theme. Where do the minds come from that will eventually argue Weisinger v. Visalia? Or craft the legal strategies to enforce the dormant blueprints of 1875?
Come from Howard.
They come from Howard, exactly.
Howard University functioned as an institutional fortress. The concept of the Mecca implies a center of gravity, a place where intellectual capital can be aggregated, refined, and deployed.
It's an incubator.
It is. You don't just build a school to grant degrees. You build an incubator to develop the specific legal and political theories necessary to dismantle systemic oppression. It was a massive multi-generational investment.
Planting trees for shade you'll never sit in.
Exactly. The leaders who dismantled Jim Crow in the 20th century We're utilizing the intellectual tools forged at institutions like Howard, which were chartered in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. It is the perfect ecosystem of progress. Build the university to train the lawyers who will change the laws to protect the people.
It is a closed-loop system of empowerment. I love seeing the connections between these dates. But institutions require capital to survive.
They do. Money is the engine.
You cannot build a university or fund a legal defense fund or sustain a political movement without hard economics. Which brings us to what might be the most fascinating mechanism of empowerment in the entire vault.
March 3rd, 1821.
March 3rd, 1821. Thomas L. Jennings receives a U.S. patent for dry scouring.
The precursor to modern dry cleaning. And Jennings holds the distinction of being the first African American to receive a U.S. patent.
On its face, it's a brilliant piece of historical trivia. Every time we drop off a suit at the dry cleaners, we are participating in a multi-billion-dollar global industry that traces its roots to a Black inventor in 1821.
It's an amazing fact on its own.
But the Source Vault elevates this from trivia to a masterclass in systemic disruption. It explicitly states that Jennings used the wealth generated by this patent to fund the abolitionist movement.
We must analyze the profound sophistication of what Jennings accomplished here. In 1821, decades before Dred Scott, a free Black man navigated the federal legal architecture to secure a patent.
Which was not easy.
No. A patent is fundamentally a state-granted monopoly. It is the absolute legally enforceable ownership of an idea.
Right.
Jennings secured that intellectual property, commercialized it, and aggregated significant personal capital.
And then he weaponized that capital against the very system that subjugated his people. It's essentially venture capitalism applied to social justice.
Precisely. Jennings recognized that moral arguments against slavery were insufficient without economic force behind them.
You need money to fight a war.
You do.
Yeah.
The abolitionist movement required printing presses, safe houses, legal representation for fugitive slaves, and political lobbying. All of that requires immense liquid capital.
So he became the bank.
He did. By turning his intellectual property into financial wealth and then funneling that wealth into radical political action, Jennings proved that economic sovereignty is the engine of liberation. He used the mechanisms of nascent American capitalism to finance the dismantling of the slave economy.
It really redefines the concept of the inventor. He didn't just invent a way to clean clothes. He invented a financial pipeline for freedom.
That's a powerful way to look at it.
And that theme of invention serving as a mechanism for communal survival brings us to Garrett Morgan, born on March 4th, 1877.
The Vault highlights two of Morgan's most vital contributions, the traffic signal and the gas mask, defining him as a master of safety and community protection.
I really want to focus on that phrase, community protection. Usually in the context of global Black history, when we talk about protection, we are talking about defense against state violence, or legal discrimination, or vigilante terror.
The human threats.
Right. But Morgan's innovations force us to expand our definition of protection to include the built environment itself.
It is the democratization of survival in an industrializing world. As cities grew denser, the physical environment became increasingly lethal. The unregulated flow of automobiles was a daily hazard.
Absolute chaos in the streets.
Total chaos. And the invisible threat of toxic fumes in industrial jobs or emergency situations was devastating. Morgan looked at the structural violence of the modern city and engineered physical interventions.
The traffic signal imposes order on chaos. It regulates the flow of machinery to prioritize human life. And the gas mask is literally a shield for the respiratory system against a toxic environment.
Both of these inventions are fundamentally about preserving the physical bodies of the community.
Which is the most basic requirement for any movement. You cannot fight for legal rights. You cannot attend Howard University. You cannot build wealth if you cannot safely cross the street or breathe the air.
Exactly. Morgan was building the literal infrastructure of survival. His work proves that technological innovation is a critical vector for civil rights. The right to safely navigate the public square is a prerequisite for all other civic participation.
So he embedded safety into the concrete and the intersections of the modern world. That's beautiful. And as we look at how innovation shapes the public square, we also have to consider who controls the culture that fills that square.
Right, the cultural output.
The final milestone in our foundation section lands on March 5th, 1921, with the incorporation of Black Swan Records.
Identified by our source as the first widely distributed Black-owned record label.
The key word here is widely distributed. We are not talking about a niche local operation pressing a few dozen records. We are talking about mass media. We are talking about establishing a nationwide mechanism for cultural distribution.
If we connect Black Swan records back to Thomas L. Jennings, we see the exact same philosophy of ownership applied to a different domain.
Oh, I see the parallel.
Jennings understood the necessity of owning his intellectual property. Black Swan understood the necessity of owning cultural property. For decades, the aesthetic brilliance, the music, and the voice of the Black community had been recorded, commodified, and distributed by white-owned corporations.
They were the raw material.
Yes, this meant the economic windfall of that culture, as well as the aesthetic control over how that culture was presented to the world, remained entirely in the hands of outsiders.
It is cultural extraction. The art is mined from the community, but the equity leaves the community entirely.
Black Swan Records completely subverts that extractive model. By owning the means of production, the recording studios, the pressing plants, the distribution networks, they reclaimed economic sovereignty over their own voices.
They dictated the terms of their own representation. Because when you own the label, you decide which artists are elevated. You decide what genres are respected, and how the marketing reflects the dignity of the community.
It is the fusion of art and commerce serving as a bulwark against cultural erasure. Black Swan wasn't just selling records. They were distributing a controlled, empowered narrative.
Distributing an empowered narrative. That concept is the perfect transition into our third and final thematic section of this deep dive.
The global stage.
Yes, because you cannot contain a narrative of this magnitude within the borders of a single nation. The source vault demands that we zoom out to the global stage. We have to examine how these concepts of sovereignty, resistance, and sacrifice played out in the international arena.
And our first entry on this global stage takes us back to the absolute genesis of the United States.
March 5th, 1770, the death of Crispus Attucks.
The vault is unequivocal. He died during the Boston Massacre, and he is named as the first martyr of the American Revolution.
I want us to really sit with the profound philosophical paradox of that sentence. You have a Black man in the year 1770 who becomes the very first casualty in a war for American independence.
The very first.
He sheds the first blood for a nation that at that exact moment legally classifies millions of people who look like him as livestock. He dies to secure the sovereignty of an empire that explicitly denies his own personal sovereignty.
It is the foundational irony of the American project. Crispus Attucks' presence at the vanguard of the colonial resistance forces us to confront the inherent contradictions of the revolution.
He wasn't just caught in the crossfire.
No, he was not a passive observer. He was actively engaged in a confrontation against British imperial troops. By positioning a man of African and indigenous descent as the inaugural sacrifice for American liberty, the historical record permanently embeds Black resistance into the DNA of the nation's origin story.
His blood is the initial down payment on the concept of American freedom. Even if the realization of that freedom for his people would be violently delayed for another century, his sacrifice is the undeniable starting point.
It is the anchor point.
And speaking of the timeline of freedom, the vault presents another astonishing temporal reality. On March 1st, it notes the birth of Blanche K. Bruce in 1841.
The biographical velocity contained in this single line of our text is staggering.
Biographical velocity, that is a great term.
Born into slavery in 1841, he ultimately became the first African American to serve a full term in the United States Senate.
We have to analyze the span of that one human life. To be born under a legal framework where you are legally designated as property, an item on a ledger with no right to your labor, your family, or your own physical body.
And
then within that exact same lifetime, to walk onto the floor of the United States Capitol, take the oath of office, and sit as a fully enfranchised voting member of the most exclusive legislative body in the world.
Bruce's trajectory fundamentally challenges our perception of systemic change. We're often taught that historical progress is a slow, glacial, multi-generational process.
Right, it takes centuries.
But Bruce's life proves that under the right geopolitical pressures, specifically the radical upheaval of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the entire architecture of a society can be inverted within a single lifespan.
The world turned upside down.
He traversed the absolute extremes of the American legal system, transitioning from the ultimate victim of the law to the architect of the law.
It is proof that massive systemic disruption is possible in the present tense. It doesn't always require a century. Sometimes a world turns upside down in a matter of decades.
Exactly.
And that kind of systemic disruption was echoing across the globe. The vault directs our attention to the Caribbean on March 7, 1848, highlighting the official abolition of slavery in St. Bartholomew.
The text notes that this was a Swedish colony and describes its abolition as a link in the global Caribbean chain.
This detail immediately challenges our standard historical assumptions. When we discuss the transatlantic slave trade and Caribbean colonialism, the narrative usually centers on the British or the French or the Spanish empires.
We rarely hear about Sweden.
Highlighting a Swedish colony is a crucial reminder that the economics of human subjugation heavily implicated a much broader swath of European powers.
It illustrates the deeply interconnected multinational nature of the colonial economy. But the most vital analytical concept here is the Caribbean chain. Abolition was not a single, coordinated global event.
It wasn't just a switch they flipped.
No, it was a volatile domino effect. Every time a territory or an island successfully dismantled the institution of slavery, whether through legislative decree like in St. Bartholomew or violent revolution like in Haiti, it exponentially increased the pressure on the surrounding colonies.
It created a geographical pressure cooker. If you are an enslaved person on a French or British island, and you know that the Swedish colony just miles across the water has achieved abolition, the status quo becomes totally untenable.
The spark is too close to the powder keg.
Right. St. Bartholomew's abolition in 1848 was one crucial destabilizing link in a massive chain reaction of liberation that eventually fractured the entire colonial economic system in the region.
And that struggle to fracture European colonialism brings us to one of the most definitive military milestones in the entire vault.
March 2nd, 1896, the Battle of Adwa.
The Battle of Adwa.
The text is stark. In 1896, Ethiopia defeated Italian colonial forces, successfully maintaining its sovereignty and instantly becoming a global symbol of African resistance. We have to contextualize the magnitude of this victory for you. In the late 19th century, the European powers were engaged in the scramble for Africa,
Aggressively carving up the continent.
carving it up with the absolute assumption of military and racial superiority.
The geopolitical expectation was total European dominance. The Battle of Adwa completely shattered that illusion. You have an independent African nation mobilizing a highly sophisticated military strategy, utilizing modern weaponry, and decisively annihilating an industrialized European army on the battlefield.
It wasn't just a defensive skirmish.
Not at all. It was a definitive, catastrophic defeat for the Italian forces.
I want to explore the psychological shockwave of that event. The vault explicitly states Ethiopia became a global symbol. If you are a Black person living anywhere in the world in 1896, whether you are navigating the brutal collapse of Reconstruction in the American South or living under colonial rule in the Caribbean or across the African continent, what does it mean to receive the news of Adwa?
It is the ultimate proof of concept. Adwa provided undeniable empirical evidence that the machinery of European imperialism was not invincible.
They could be beaten.
They could be beaten. It completely disrupted the global narrative of inevitable white supremacy. By maintaining its absolute sovereignty, Ethiopia became a psychological beacon. It demonstrated that through unity, strategic brilliance, and military force, an African nation could dictate its own destiny on the world stage.
It shifted the global consciousness of the diaspora.
From a paradigm of endurance to a paradigm of triumphant resistance.
It planted a seed of sovereign possibility that would take decades to fully bloom. And the vault provides the perfect chronological follow-up to that seed. We jump forward from the military victory of 1896 to the political victory of March 6, 1957.
Ghana's independence.
Ghana's independence. Led by Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana became the first sub-Saharan colony to regain its sovereignty.
The specific vocabulary used in the source here is incredibly important. It says regain sovereignty. It does not say they achieved it, or that they were granted it by the British.
Regain.
Regain. That linguistic distinction is everything. To say a nation achieved independence implies that sovereignty is the new state of being, perhaps bestowed by a benevolent colonizer when the colonizer deemed ready.
Like it's a gift.
Exactly. But the word regain completely delegitimizes the entire colonial era. It frames colonialism not as a natural state of affairs, but as a temporary, illegal, and violent interruption of Africa's natural sovereignty.
So they were just taking back what was always theirs.
Yes. Nkrumah and the people of Ghana were not asking for a new right. They were reclaiming an ancient one.
And just as Adwa served as a global symbol in the 19th century, Ghana's independence operated as the catalyst for the 20th century. By being the first sub-Saharan colony to break the political grip of the British Empire, Ghana fired the starting gun for the massive wave of decolonization.
It proved that the political dismantling of the empire was achievable.
setting off a new chain reaction that would reshape the map of the world throughout the 1960s. So we see military sovereignty secured at Adwa and political sovereignty reclaimed in Ghana.
But there is a third mechanism of global influence.
One that reaches across borders faster and deeper than either armies or politicians. And that brings us to the final entry in our vault, born on March 4th, 1932.
Miriam Makeba.
Miriam Makeba, known globally as Mama Africa. The source describes her as the voice that connected the struggle against South African apartheid to the rest of the world. I want us to analyze art as a geopolitical tool.
It's a fascinating angle.
We talked earlier about Black Swan Records controlling the means of cultural production. Here we see Miriam Makeba weaponizing her own voice to internationalize a localized human rights crisis.
Apartheid was a deeply entrenched, militarized, and legally impenetrable system of oppression. The South African government controlled the internal narrative and heavily censored the flow of information.
So how do you fight that? How do you dismantle a machine that controls all the domestic levers of power?
You have to externalize the pressure. You have to force the international community to care. Makeba functioned as an acoustic mirror.
An acoustic mirror, that is a brilliant way to conceptualize it.
She reflected the brutal, hidden realities of apartheid out onto the global stage through the undeniable beauty and power of her music. When international audiences connected with her art, they were inextricably connecting with the pain, the resilience, and the humanity of her homeland.
She bypassed the political censors.
She did, by speaking directly to the conscience of the global public. Her art mobilized cultural boycotts, influenced United Nations resolutions, and made it politically untenable for Western democracies to continue quietly supporting the apartheid regime.
She humanized a geopolitical abstraction. People might easily ignore a news report about a foreign policy dispute, but they cannot ignore the emotional truth of a song.
Never.
Makeba proves that resistance is not solely the domain of lawyers in courtrooms or soldiers on battlefields. Sometimes the most devastating blow to an oppressive regime is a voice that simply refuses to be silenced.
From the meticulous patent filings of Thomas Jennings, to the physical endurance on the bridge in Selma, to the military strategy at Adwa, to the vocal cords of Miriam Makeba, the methodologies of progress detailed in this single week are infinitely diverse.
And deeply interconnected.
Very deeply.
And that interconnected diversity is exactly what this deep dive has revealed to us. As we reach the end of this vault, I want us to take one final look at the sheer, overwhelming density of the history we've just unpacked. Remember the strict parameters we established at the beginning.
Just 7 days.
Every single event, every life, every law, and every victory we discussed today occurred between March 1st and March 7th.
It is a profound testament to the relentless, multidimensional nature of human striving.
It truly is. In the space of just 7 days on a calendar, we have traced a continuous lineage from the Boston Massacre in 1770 all the way to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. We have traversed a geographical landscape that took us from the chambers of the California Supreme Court to the newly freed communities sustained by the Freedmen's Bureau across the Atlantic, to the battlefields of Ethiopia, and into the recording studios of Black Swan Records.
If there is a singular, overarching synthesis to extract from this text, it is that progress functions as an ecosystem.
An ecosystem.
It is never reliant on a single tactic. The physical sacrifices of Bloody Sunday were necessary to force the legal protections of the Voting Rights Act. But those legal protections require the intellectual frameworks incubated at institutions like Howard University.
The chain is all connected.
And those institutions were built on the economic foundations established by innovators like Thomas Jennings. And all of this domestic struggle drew sustained psychological nourishment from the global victories of sovereignty in places like Adwa and Ghana. It is a massive interwoven architecture of resistance.
An ecosystem of progress. I think that is the perfect framing. And that leaves me with a final provocative thought that I want you, our listener, to carry with you long after this conversation ends.
Let's hear it.
We have just spent this entire deep dive thoroughly interrogating merely the first 7 days of March. Just one single week. If exactly 1 week of the calendar can yield this much foundational, world-altering history, from the traffic lights that regulate our physical safety every day, to the dry cleaning processes we take for granted, to the dormant legal blueprints that eventually secure our civil rights, to the very concept of global sovereignty.
That's a lot for 7 days.
It's massive. So if 1 week holds all of that, how much of the rest of the year's hidden history are we walking past completely oblivious every single day of our lives?
It is a question that demands we fundamentally alter our relationship with the past. It challenges us to recognize that history is not a static textbook. It is the living infrastructure of our present reality.
It is the infrastructure of our present reality. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We always value the opportunity to explore these vaults with you.
Keep questioning the systems around you. Keep learning and look closely at the history hiding in plain sight.
See you next time, everyone. Take care.